Good evening. My name is Amanda Soa, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Firm for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many indigenous people that lived on these lands, as well as the thousands of indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clark Firm, the Center for Spirituality and Social Justice, the Asbel Center for Jewish Life, the Poppleshaw Center for Race and Ethnicity, Dickinson Christian Fellowship, the Department of Religion, Sociology, and Middle East Studies, I would like to welcome you to tonight's Wesley Lecture, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. The Wesley Lecture grew out of the historical relationship between Dickinson College and the Methodist Church that began in the 19th century. The lecture highlights contemporary conversations and controversies in faith communities and in higher education. It focuses on the importance of community, commitment, and service for the education of the citizen scholar. Our speaker tonight, Sahar Aziz, will continue this tradition as she discusses the impact of the racialized Muslim highlighted in her book, which shares the same name as tonight's lecture. While I face many discriminatory actions as a Black woman, my Christian faith has never been a source of added oppression. After college, I know that I can find a place of worship and a community in most places in the United States. But this has not been the experience for most Muslims whose existence has been construed as a threat to the United States. Unknown to most people, Islam has existed in the United States since its founding. It was practiced by enslaved Africans who originated from West Africa. Eventually, the practice was diminished and forgotten through the presence of the dominant Christian religion. But as immigration conditions relaxed in the 19th century and well into the 20th century, Islam reemerged through an increase in Muslim immigration from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Like most immigration groups, they were searching for economic opportunity and economic freedoms. As Islam became more practiced, some African Americans found inspiration in the religion to fight against racial inequalities, resulting in numerous Islamic organizations and coalitions. These movements, while empowering for those involved, contributed to negative stereotypes that had begun to frame Islam as violent and militant in the 20th century. Additionally, political events in the Middle East and in the States furthered anti-Islamic sentiment. The most prominent was the terrorist attack led by Osama bin Laden on September 11, 2001 in New York and Washington, D.C. The attack tarnished the image of Islam in the media, which led to a major outbreak of Islamophobia. It also led to efforts that falsely stereotyped Arab Americans as radical Muslims and associated the Islamic religion to the actions of a few Muslim radicals. Today, Muslim Americans are still being impacted by these false assumptions. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Firm welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. For our online viewers, the question and answer session will not be live streamed or recorded. At this time, I ask you to please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, please know that the handicap-accessible exits are located on the west side of the building. Aziz will be introduced by Professor Eric Love, an associate professor of sociology at Dickinson College and the author of the 2017 book, Islamophobia and Racism in America. And now, please join me in welcoming Professor Eric Love.
Thank you, Amanda, for that really excellent opening for tonight. I'm Eric Love. Before we get started, I hope it's okay. if I just ask for a brief moment of silence in recognition of, I'm very grateful we can gather together in these very trying times. And I just want to acknowledge that there's this great loss of life now in what looks like, what looks like a war. And I just thought we should just take a moment here just to reflect on how lucky we are that we can be here together tonight and have this conversation. So if you wouldn't mind joining me for just a moment. Thank you. And thanks to our hosts for making this event possible tonight, the Clark Forum, all the sponsors. And in particular, I'd like to thank Cody Nielsen for making this connection and asking me to do this introduction. It's a distinct honor and privilege to be able to introduce our guest tonight, Professor Sahar Aziz, for the Wesley Lecture. I'm going to be brief because I'm just as eager as you are to hear from Professor Aziz. But I could go on about her many accomplishments and her innovative scholarship for quite some time. So I'm going to do my best. If you'll put up with me, I'm going to try not to fanboy too much. But I do want to describe a little bit about Professor Aziz's many contributions to the discussion on this topic. And first things first, in order to really understand just how powerful Professor Aziz's work has been, you need to understand that there is this fundamental tension. I'm sure many of you, this won't be news to you, but I think I'm going to just try to lay out this tension it confounds people. It confounds even experts, even dedicated activists that have committed their careers to anti-racist work. They struggle with this tension. All right, so here it is. One, there's two things that are true at the same time. First thing that's true is Islam is not a race. It isn't. It's a religion. I mean, it's obvious, right? Muslims, believers in Islam, they come from all walks of life. They come from all over the world. There's, I'm sure you've heard the numbers, over 1 billion Muslims, every continent. There's no way, of course, in reality to look Muslim. There's no one way that a Muslim appears. And when we're talking about race, as Professor Aziz has written, race is that term we have for the socially constructed idea that physical appearance is relevant in our lives. So physical appearance, right? Skin tone, hair texture, facial features, these are given relevance by the concept, the socially constructed concept of race. And Muslims, it shouldn't need to be said, can and do have all kinds of physical appearances. There is no racial group that is Muslim. At the same time, anti-Muslim animus is motivated by racism. Racism is a concept that's not very easy to define, so I'm going to leave that to Professor Aziz. Sorry, I'm just going to leave that for you to take care of. I'm not even going to, I don't know, but I think we can all agree, whatever the definition of racism is that you want to work with, it does involve race, right? I mean, it's right there in the term. You can't really get past that. So if Islam is not a race, how can anti-Islamic sentiment be racist? This is the tension. And that's the thing. This is the awful power and the terrible magic of race and racism, is that they don't care about facts. In America and in many other places around the world, there is a socially constructed set of categories that includes Muslim or Middle Eastern or Asian, and this propels racism. The fact that these racial categories exist, it's racism that affects not only Muslims, but Sikhs, Christians, Jews, many other religious, ethnic, and national communities. And so Professor Aziz's work has done much to illuminate this tension. Unlike many other scholars, she looks directly at the complex connective tissue between religion and race. She painstakingly reconstructs historical events, she critically examines trends and countervailing movements, and she closely analyzes texts popular and scholarly, to present a comprehensive and up-to-the-minute look at the social construction of the racial Muslim, of course, the title of her brand new, hot off the press, 2022 book. Many other scholars take shortcuts or focus on just one or two parts of the overall picture, but Professor Aziz is able to bring it all into focus in her work. And it's not just in her newest book that she's done this, by the way. In many articles and papers over the past decade, she's delivered incisive analyses about the historical, sociological, and legal frameworks that contribute to anti-Muslim racism. Let me just give you one example. Briefly after she left her role as a senior advisor in the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Homeland Security, Professor Aziz wrote a paper entitled Selective Counterterrorism in a Post-9/11 America. In that paper, she expertly described what she called, quote, the racial subtext of homegrown terrorism. So way back in 2011, she was writing about the dangerous power behind the bigoted idea that white Christian groups would not pose a serious threat to the United States, and only black and brown Muslim groups were a danger for terrorism. I think we can see that she was rather prescient as she was examining the connective tissue between race, racism, and religion. So by describing the sociological and legal aspects of religious practice, Professor Aziz has really enabled a new generation of scholarship and policy reform that tackles anti-Muslim bigotry. She knows how much work remains to be done if the United States is to live up to its ideals as a beacon of racial and ethnic inclusion and religious freedom. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming, for the Wesley Lecture tonight, Professor Sahar Aziz. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks.
All right. Assalamu alaikum. May peace be upon you. Hello, good evening. I'm going to put this up here so people who want to buy it. Okay. It's such an honor to be here on your beautiful campus. Dickinson has a phenomenal reputation of being a place where students and faculty search for truth, right, in a civil way, with good faith, or in good faith. And I really appreciate you providing me with an opportunity to provide my perspective, which is certainly one that is not often permitted in certain venues, in certain forums. I'm a very untraditional law professor, and so I do appreciate the fact that you guys are intentional in the different perspectives that you bring. And I want to thank Cody Nielsen for hosting me and his team, his phenomenal team, for the logistics and the organizing. I want to thank Professor Eric Love, whose book was instrumental in my research. And I highly recommend that you read his literature, his scholarship as well, because I certainly relied on it quite a bit. And I want to thank the Clark Forum and all of the co-sponsors to this event. It's with your support, with your donations, with having something, of this program, this nature, you provide these opportunities for students to get exposed to different ideas. So I'm going to give a formal talk, and then I will open it up for a Q&A where we can have more of an exchange. As we shuffled out of class, the tension in the air was palpable. Instead of the usual sounds of law student chatter, the halls were eerily quiet. I walked toward the lobby, noticing a large congregation of students huddled around the television. I heard gasps at the replays of 2 commercial airplanes crashing into the World Trade Center. What happened on that Tuesday of my second week of my first year of law school is etched in my memory forever. It was the day when I went from being racially ambiguous to racially threatening. As television stations replayed the horrific scenes alongside analysts providing facts piecemeal, a theme was beginning to emerge. This may have been a terrorist attack, not an accident. And the suspected perpetrators were Arab Muslims. The stares of my classmates felt like lasers. But I quickly left the law school as my mind turned to the safety of my mother, who wore the hijab. I feared the backlash would be violent. I worried she would be assaulted or attacked at the large public hospital where she worked. I also worried about my father, whose first name is Muhammad and who speaks with a heavy foreign accent. Would their coworkers accost or worse, assault them out of a desire for revenge? Would they be afraid to go to work, to the grocery store, to the mosque? Would we be blamed for these atrocious criminal acts? Our lives in America as invisible minorities were over. We were now racial Muslims. Everything, ranging from our mosques and charities to our travel and clothing, was under scrutiny. American media now associated all things related to Islam with terrorism and threats to national security. Fast forward 10 years later. Quote, the New York Police Department gathered intelligence on 250 plus mosques, student groups in terrorist hunt, end quote. Read the Associated Press headline on August 24th, 2011. Investigative reporters had uncovered a massive multi-year surveillance program wherein the NYPD, in collaboration with the FBI, was intentionally spying on tens of thousands of Muslims in the tri-state area, including Rutgers University students. What many of us in the civil rights community had long suspected was now confirmed. Simply being Muslim was sufficient to attract the invasive scrutiny of the state. Having advocated for the civil rights of Muslims for nearly a decade by then, I thought through different legal theories to challenge the NYPD surveillance program. My research led me to something called Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, a law that restricts recipients of federal funding from discriminating in their provision of services. Local and state police departments are among the largest recipients of federal funds from the U.S. Department of Justice and Homeland Security. So I thought I was onto something that could avoid the lacuna of the Equal Protection Clause that had thus far failed to protect Muslims and other minorities from discrimination. But there was one problem. The text of Title VI. It reads, quote, no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal assistance. Religion is glaringly absent under Title VI. Muslims, thus, are unprotected by the statute. Muslim identity is not a race in any phenotypical sense. Indeed, as Professor Love noted, Muslims are the most diverse faith community in the United States, comprised of 30% African American, 30% from the Middle East and North Africa, 30% from South Asia, 5% from Latinx, and 5% multiracial. And they also are comprised of immigrants from more than 75 different countries across the world. So this diversity makes it hard for a lawyer to prove that a particular race or national origin, as required by Title VI, is the basis for which national security practices are directed at Muslims which violate their civil liberties. And yet what we're witnessing in the post-9/11 era is a type and degree of profiling and targeting more closely resembling the racial discrimination experienced by African Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Americans of all faiths. So, Muslims are in fact being treated as a race, and more specifically a suspect race, rather than as a religious minority to be protected from persecution. For that reason, government officials and members of the public who may in fact believe in religious freedom norms do not view targeting Muslims in national security and immigration practices as a threat to religious freedom in the United States. And herein lies the genesis of the book. My research led me to much more fundamental questions with much broader implications for all Americans. Is our stated commitment to religious freedom meaningful? Does it apply equally to all faiths? If so, then how can we explain the systematic subordination of Muslims, including physical attacks on and surveillance of their houses of worship under the guise of national security? The explanation, I believe, lies in the racialization of a minority religious group, a process with a protracted and checkered history in the United States. So this book interrogates how and why a country where religious freedom is a founding principle in law and society produces such overt prejudice and discrimination against Muslims, a religious minority. How does the critical mass of Americans in the 21st century that hold unfavorable views of Muslims on the one hand reconcile their mistreatment with the nations and their own commitments to religious freedom on the other hand? More pointedly, How do Christian religious conservatives who decry assaults on their own religious freedom justify their support, as shown in numerous polls, for state practices that infringe on Muslims' religious freedom? I proffer that the explanation lies in how racism intersects with religion to racialize a religion's followers and consequently exclude them from the panoply of religious freedom protections. Put simply, racialization causes a faith community's religious freedoms to be circumscribed or denied altogether. But the ways in which particular religious communities are racialized depends on both domestic and international factors unique to those communities. Thus, my intervention is twofold. First, I argue that the racialization of immigrant Muslims who came after 1965 and their children is grounded in a racial religious hierarchy as opposed to just a racial hierarchy, to socially construct what I call the racial Muslim. Second, I proffer that there is a topology of the racial Muslim, not a dichotomy, not the good Muslim and the bad Muslim, but it's actually more hierarchical, that explains why some Muslims are more likely to be targeted by the government than other Muslims, and also targeted by private Islamophobia. Now, 4 factors converge to racialize Muslims to produce the racial Muslim. Those 4 factors are white Protestant supremacy, which affects all minorities, xenophobia arising from coercive assimilationism into Western European cultural norms, which affects all minorities, Orientalism, which is unique, and American empire in Muslim-majority countries. So I explore how each of these factors interacts politically, socially, and discursively to define the characteristics attributed to racial Muslims that in turn legitimize their systemic subordination. The co-constitutive nature of religion and race means neither identity exists in isolation, but rather they interact, right, to produce this racial religious hierarchy. And therefore, religious identity in certain contexts serves as or functions as a racial marker. That is, and also along those lines, the social construction of whiteness is shaped as much by religious identity as it is by skin color, hair texture, facial features, and other phenotypical characteristics. Now, as a critical race theorist, yes, I'm guilty as charged, I recognize that race is a social construction, not a biological fact, but it has real-life material consequences. So I adopt Edward Bonilla Silva's definition of race as, quote, an organizing principle of social relationships that shapes the identity of individual actors at the micro level and shapes all spheres of social life at the macro level. That is, racism arises from racialized social systems in societies where economic, political, social, and ideological levels are partially structured by the placement of actors in racial categories or races. Now, in applying this structural racism analysis, I also adopt Derek Bell's black-white paradigm and Joe Fagan's white racial frame, which argues that blacks are permanently at the bottom of the American racial hierarchy and whites are permanently at the top. Now, racial stratification, according to the black-white paradigm, causes different races to experience positions of subordination and superordination in society and develop different interests accordingly. So, you find often that races that are more at the bottom of this hierarchy are frequently depicted as savage, uncivilized, and unfit for self-government. Races at the top tend to be depicted as civilized, liberal, democratic. The systemic analytical approach differs notably from the social psychology approach that characterizes racism as an individual phenomena arising from individual prejudice or individual stereotypes. Now, my theoretical frame takes the systemic racialization theory one step further to argue that, again, the American racial hierarchy is really more accurately described as a religious racial hierarchy. Phenotypical race in American society has been and continues to be a central factor in the placement of people in racial categories. However, religion also plays a dispositive role. This has always been true for blacks, who are racialized as heathen and inferior based on biblical stories labeling them as the children of Ham cursed into slavery. It was also true for religious minorities such as Jews, Catholics, and Mormons in the 19th century and first half of the 20th century, and for Muslims today, albeit for different reasons and with different material harms. So, Islamic tenets, regardless whether practiced or believed in fact, impute onto Muslims inherent cultural traits that operate biologically to make them inferior in a white Judeo-Christian dominant society. For example, believing in nonviolent jihad, polygamy, sharia, hijab, fasting, Ramadan, Hajj, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, all that is associated with a Muslim's purported innate sense of despotism, savagery, heathenism, and illiberalism. Now, for both religious conservatives and secular elites in the US, these religious beliefs and practices cast Muslims as outsiders to American national identity. And more specifically, it casts Muslims as suspected terrorists. Now, racial constraints on religious freedom can be traced to the Puritans' motivations for leaving England. They came to the New World to practice their religion without fear of persecution. They also came to colonize the land pursuant to what they believed was a covenant with God entailing civilizing the purported savage natives. Deploying divine justifications of conquest, similar to Christopher Columbus's proclaimed God-ordained destiny to discover new lands, the Puritans and some other Protestants who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony believed they were children of God with a holy mandate to create a utopian Protestant society. This founding generation believed America was an enchanted land, a city on the hill, where God commanded them to foster and protect Protestantism, which they believed was pure Christianity. This white Protestant notion of manifest destiny has since animated America's national identity. When the Puritan settlers arrived in America, they found that the native peoples not only looked different, but also practiced unfamiliar religions. Although a diverse group with differing views on the separation of church and state, Puritans and the early Protestants had no qualms about exploiting, appropriating, and dominating Native Americans, whom they believed were heathens and pagans. Puritans interpreted Native Americans' religions as either evil or no religion at all. Either interpretation confirmed their belief that the native peoples, again, were uncivilized savages, and it was the white man's burden to deculturalize and civilize Native Americans, including through conversion. Now, Christians' belief in the inferiority of Africans at the time mirrored the racialization of Native Americans and was similarly integrated into colonial laws. So, for example, in a 1690s preamble to the South Carolina slavery law, it states, enslaved Africans describes them as of barbarous, wild, savage natures, and constitutions, laws, and orders should in this province be made and enacted for the good regulating and ordering of them, as they may restrain the disorders, rapines, and inhumanity to which they are naturally prone and inclined. So likewise, the slave codes passed in the late 17th century emphasized skin color and religion as that which divided the superior from the inferior. And white settlers associated enslaved Africans' non-Christian religions with real or imagined inferior racial characteristics or physical traits. Now, notably, a sizable number of enslaved Africans were Muslims, which only confirmed the colonialist beliefs that they were heathens. However, if an African Muslim slave could read Arabic, he was labeled an Arab or a Moor, inferior to whites but superior to blacks, because white slave owners deemed Africans incapable of being literate. So according to this European supremacist logic, Northern Africa belonged to the Asiatic world, which, although inferior to Europe, was superior to sub-Saharan Africa. Now, although being Christian was not necessary for attaining legal citizenship in the US, being socially raced as white was. The 1790 law that says you must be white in order to naturalize to become a US citizen. So as a result, the millions of European Jewish and Catholic immigrants who were white by law however, did not receive the social, economic, and political privileges of social whiteness. So two waves of mass immigration between the mid-19th century and early 20th century triggered a white nativist backlash similar to today's xenophobia against Latinos, Muslims, and Asian immigrants. Between 1830 and 1930, approximately 38 million immigrants came to the US. In 1870, the population was approximately 70 million people in the US. So think about that percentage of immigrants that are coming. Nearly from 1900 to 1930, in just a 30-year span, 16 million immigrants arrived to the US. And to give you some context, in 1920, immigrants and their children made up 70% of New York City's population. They made up 72% of Chicago's population, and they made up 69% of Cleveland's population. Now, this major influx of immigrants, however, was composed primarily of non-Protestants, of Eastern European Jews, of Irish Catholics, and of Italian Catholics. By the second decade of the 20th century, Southern and Eastern Europeans were immigrating at twice the number of the so-called English-speaking races. The Ku Klux Klan, which had been established in the 1860s to terrorize newly freed enslaved newly freed Africans and African Americans, reemerged in the 1920s to proclaim Catholics and Jews, as well as blacks, a threat to America. But in contrast to the covert Klan of the 1860s and 1870s, the Klan in the early 1900s reemerged in mass public events. They recruited in advertisements and newspapers, and they elected members to political office. With Anglo-Protestant nativism anxiety at fever pitch at the time, the Klan membership peaked in the mid-1920s, an estimated 4 million members in over 43 states. The Klan, notably, conflated white nationalism with religion in defense of a Protestant America. Its slogan was, quote, "Native white Protestant supremacy." And it attracted primarily lower and middle-class white Protestant males. Similar to German Nazism and Italian fascism, the Klan's white supremacist ideology proclaimed that America must retain its Anglo-Saxon and Protestant identity in accordance with its manifest destiny. The Klan incorporated Protestant churches and evangelicalism into its core mission, invocation of religious terminology, labeling white Protestants as pure and godly, and non-whites and non-Protestants as impure, ungodly, and traitorous, attracted an estimated 40,000 Protestant ministers to join the Klan. Now, the Klan's white supremacist ideology proclaimed, again, that America must remain Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. Now, but the nativists, these nativists that supported the Klan and others who may not have explicitly supported the Klan, demanded a curb on immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. Similar to President Trump's and his white nativist supporters' contemporary calls to stop so-called chain migration from non-European countries, including Central America and even more explicitly Muslim-majority countries, vis-a-vis the Muslim ban. Failure to curb immigration, according to these nativists in the early 20th century, would lead to race suicide of the American old stock, warned nativists, among them whom were Presidents Theodore Roosevelt Jr., President Woodrow Wilson, and President Calvin Coolidge. A taxonomy of European races mixed eugenics with biblical reasoning, whereas a person's geographic origin, skin tone, and religion were attributed to their levels of intelligence, physical health, and moral and political characteristics. So although legally white, Hebrews, Iberians, Levantines, Alpines, and Slavs were not necessarily socially white, unless or on condition that they assimilate into Northern European Protestant culture. So ultimately, race became a means to rationalize the exclusion of certain groups from obtaining rights, economic opportunity, and legal as well as social equality. Now, an interesting fact that few people know is that there was something called the Dictionary of Races or People that was produced in the 1911 Dillingham Commission Report on Immigration. In it, there were 45 races counted entering the US. Of those 45 races, 36 of them were indigenous to Europe. So think about the social construction of whiteness and how now we don't even have that concept, right? Now everyone from Europe is just socially constructed as white. The Immigration Restriction League at that time submitted a report to the Dillingham Commission on Immigration in support of restricting immigration because, quote, "A considerable proportion of the immigrants now coming are from races and countries which have not progressed, but have been backward, downtrodden, and relatively useless for centuries." And they were talking about Eastern and Southern Europeans primarily. One report, for example, classified 60% of Jews as morons. Political elites of the time also believed Jews were unfit for citizenship because they were antisocial and anti-democratic. Very similar themes we hear against Muslims post 9/11. Scientific racism's effect on immigration policy culminated in strict national origin quotas in 1924, in the 1924 Immigration Act, which severely curbed immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as Asia, which Asians had been excluded from as early as the 1880s. So for the next 40 years, from 1924 to 1965, 70% of immigrants would come from the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Germany. And that had religious implications as well in terms of their identity. So the history of Jewish and Catholic immigrants from Europe bring into sharper relief the role of religion in the racialization process. These communities were legally white, similar to Muslims from the Middle East and North Africa today. However, their religion socially raised them as a threat to Anglo-Saxon Protestant national identity. And although the white nativist ideology that racialized Jews, Catholics, and Mormons in the 20th century is deployed against Muslims today, racialization of Islam is distinct in various ways. Specifically, European Orientalism and American imperial ambitions in the Muslim-majority countries placed immigrant Muslims permanently outside the national identity. The contemporary portrayal of Islam as a violent political ideology and a false religion is not a new phenomenon. Europe historically situated Islam as the antithesis of modernity and enlightenment, and such that a clash with Western Christendom was inevitable. Popular narratives that Islam is malevolent and spread by the sword were grounded in European geopolitics and Christian theology. White Protestants believed their race and religion was superior to that of the so-called Mohammedan Turk, and American missionaries traveling to the Middle East as early as the mid-1800s would return with accounts that further racialized Muslims as men of unrestrained passions full of falsehood and blasphemy. They believed these Orientals, whether Muslim or Christian, needed to be saved by the West, a recurring theme of American Orientalism up to the present day. Because, of course, we went to Afghanistan to save the women, right? At the turn of the 20th century, European colonies across the world agitated for independence. The Middle East and North Africa, previously ruled by the Ottomans, were no exception. Among them were Palestinians, who were at the time governed by the British based on the Sykes-Picot Agreement that drew artificial borders between French and British-controlled territories. As more Jews fled from pogroms in Eastern Europe to Palestine, they purchased land using foreign funding as part of a European Zionist settler project. And the British allowed the mass land purchases, notwithstanding that Jewish landowners were refusing to sell land to Palestinians, and that only heightened communal tensions. But consistent with global colonialist practices, pitting Arabs and Jews against each other strengthened British domination over Palestine. But Palestinians protested and revolted in 1929 and 1936 against this growing and expanding Zionist settler project, prompted the British to restrict Jewish migration and land purchases pursuant to the British White Paper of 1939. So despite its lofty goal of providing Jews with a permanent homeland where they would no longer face centuries of European anti-Semitism, not Middle Eastern anti-Semitism, Zionism became instrumental in dehumanizing Palestinians in American politics and culture. So at the start of World War II, the American Zionist movement's efforts to establish the State of Israel was gaining momentum. By 1945, magazines and televisions projected into American homes images of Jewish corpses stacked on top of each other and emaciated bodies of Holocaust survivors. Of the nearly 1 million displaced people, more than 250,000 were stateless Jews seeking to immigrate to Palestine. And remember, at that time, America had its national origin quotas. And so if you were from Eastern Europe, you couldn't come to the United States. You couldn't immigrate. As Americans realized the gravity of their nation's failure to help Jewish refugees during the Holocaust, which included turning ships away who ultimately went back and were killed in Auschwitz, many Christians, American Christians, believed it was their moral obligation to support a Jewish homeland. And what better place than the Holy Land? After 1945, Jewish Americans were also starting to emerge as a voter base courted by politicians. By 1948, when the State of Israel was created in what is known as the Nakba, the disaster for Palestinians, leaders of nearly 5 million second-generation Jewish Americans mobilized to successfully pressure the Truman administration to recognize the State of Israel. And we were the first to do so, the first country in the world. So when British officials criticized President Truman for his obvious favoritism towards Israel, because at the time the UN had a very different position, he stated, "I have to answer to hundreds of thousands who are anxious for the success of Zionism. I do not have hundreds of thousands in my constituents, hundreds of thousands of Arabs, in my constituents." So meanwhile, the media portrayed citizens of the newly recognized Jewish state as industrious and brave, often compared to the hardworking Puritans who founded God's American Israel. Israelis would bring civilization and democracy to the backward Muslim Orient. The Arab Palestinians, in contrast, were depicted in pictures and texts as irrational barbarians when they defended lands on which they had lived for centuries. Now, at that time, Americans' foreign policy priorities were also shifting dramatically. Specifically, the US sought to control the oil reserves in the Middle East and prevent the Soviet Union from expanding its global influence. Therefore, no longer were Muslims a threat, a distant threat for European colonialists to manage. They were now America's problem, as it sought to commandeer Muslim-majority lands as client states in a burgeoning Cold War. The racial Muslim construct was now starting to emerge in the United States. But Muslims could still be useful. In 1957, a working group of intelligence and defense officials in the Eisenhower administration published a report that concluded that Islam was more compatible with Christianity as compared to communism, such that it could be deployed to rally support in the Cold War. So the CIA agreed that the US should deploy religion, Islam, to fight communism by supporting none other than the Muslim Brotherhood, who is now a public enemy in our foreign policy in the Middle East, and other political Islamists who oppose the secularism of Arab nationalist leaders, the same leaders who were also toying with allying with Russia in order to counter America's hegemonic ambitions in the region. So this so-called Islam strategy would eventually lead to America's financial support of none other than Osama bin Laden and his mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, the same ones who later planned the September 11th attacks in New York City. So when it benefited US interests, the United States sent military aid to the mujahideen, calling them freedom fighters against the Soviet Union. But as soon as they were no longer useful to the US, or when they no longer agreed with US policy, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, the same group of people were now designated as a terrorist group, right? So after 9/11, all political Islamists, regardless whether they supported violence or nonviolence, would be grouped together in the Muslim terrorist trope, leading to the criminalization of what I call the religious dissident racial Muslim and the religious racial Muslim, which I'll get into in a minute. Now, the September 11th attacks thus finalized a transformation of Muslim identity that had been in the making for decades. The racial markers of Muslim identity now became tied to Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Taliban, Hamas. Persons who looked, dressed like, or had the same name as terrorists profiled in the media were collectively treated as racial Muslims. Moreover, as Professor Love noted, people of South Asian origin, whether Hindu, Sikh, Christian, or Muslim, joined Arabs in being Muslim-looking. Racial Muslims, however, are not all treated the same by the government or private actors. Accordingly, the racial Muslim comprises an internal hierarchy that determines which Muslims are most and least likely to be targeted. The hierarchy is shaped by a Muslim's level of religiosity and the extent of their political descent. So the 5 typologies of the racial Muslim, starting from the one that is deemed the most dangerous to the state to the one that's deemed the least dangerous to the state, and that also correlates with suspicion by private actors. The first is the religious dissident racial Muslim. The second is the religious racial Muslim, who may be either apolitical or mainstream in their politics. The third is the secular dissident racial Muslim, and the fourth is the secular racial Muslim, who's secular and does not have any, not political or very mainstream. And then finally is the former Muslim, and that's usually women who have converted out of the faith and who then are supported, often financially and politically, to go and publish books and go on book tours and speaking engagements to declare how awful Islam is, how misogynistic it is, how oppressive it is. And they use their status as people who were born Muslim and having converted as the credibility. So, while skin color, hair texture, facial features, and other phenotypical traits still affect the racialization process, phenotype is now subsumed by this now racialized Muslim identity. So put another way, a white presenting immigrant, or child of an immigrant, named Muhammad, who practices Islam, cannot escape Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism in the post-9/11 era. So even if he's white presenting, his name, which then marks him, right, as a Muslim, essentially transfers him out of any kind of physical phenotype of whiteness that would grant him that status. The typology partially explains also the interplay between the state's prioritization of certain Muslims in national security enforcement on the one hand and individual identity performance by Muslims seeking to avoid the material and dignitary harms arising from racialization on the other hand. So, secularism and support for American militarism in Muslim-majority countries signify higher levels of assimilation into white Christian normalcy, or white Judeo-Christian normalcy, and therefore those people are less likely to be suspected, less likely to be on a terrorist watch list or being screened at airports or profiled. Therefore, the secular racial Muslim is the least threatening for both liberal elites and religious conservatives. Now, double standards lie at the heart of the racialization process, whomever is the target. Members of the dominant racial religious group are treated and judged by their individual actions. So after January 6, 2021, nobody is going around saying all white men are extremists. We only hold those people who did something wrong or whoever violated the law on January 6, 2021 as responsible for their wrongdoing. But when you're a member of a subordinated racialized group, you're presumed guilty based on the misdeeds and wrongdoing of a few individuals who share your religious identity or national origin, unless you individually prove your innocence and say, I'm not like them, right? And that is a significant material consequence or harmful consequence of racialization. So this begs the question, why do Christian conservatives who hate Muslims, and this is shown in the polls, and if you look at those who voted for Trump, the unfavorability rankings against Muslims goes into the 70th percentile. And they often identify as Christian evangelicals. Why do they not believe that they are betraying religious freedom principles when they support Muslim travel bans, when they oppose the construction of mosques, when they approve singling out Muslims in countering terrorism? I argue that they reconcile the contradictions by redefining Islam altogether and by placing it outside the purview of religion. To them, Islam is not a religion, but a political ideology. Islam is not holy. It is man-made by savages. And so as a result, defaming, harassing, and attacking Muslims is not un-American or antithetical to religious freedom norms. To the contrary, it is as rational as rounding up Japanese Americans after the Pearl Harbor attacks, when the US government determined they were godless pagans incapable of being loyal to a liberal democratic America. Now, law in the post-9/11 era is instrumental in creating racial projects that make policy, shape state action, and affect Muslims' daily personal interactions. My exploration of how law is deployed to normatively exclude Muslims from the realm of legally protected religion is the subject of chapters 8 and 9. Both religious conservatives and secular elites under the leadership of George W. Bush, the leadership of Barack Obama, the leadership of Donald Trump, all of them adopted national security policies targeting Muslims, albeit to different degrees. Among the long list are the Muslim ban, torture and indefinite detention at Guantanamo Bay, extrajudicial killings using drones, the National Security Entry-Exit Special Registration Program, massive surveillance, targeted use of sting operations against Muslims in anti-terrorism investigations, terrorist watch lists, and the list goes on. So the securitization of Muslim identity through state actions violate civil liberties and rights, yet they're deemed politically justified by the American public. And private acts that would otherwise be viewed as religiously discriminatory are rationalized as patriotic vigilance or unfortunate consequences of necessary national security policies. So, in closing, my theoretical frame begs the question, what is the future of the racial Muslim? Is it a permanent fixture in American race politics, or a temporal construction that will dissipate over time as we now shift our focus to the Ukraine and Russia or China? Will Muslims call for a new Abrahamic national identity, replace the Judeo-Christian identity? Will that succeed in allowing some Muslims into the fold of whiteness and by extension first-class citizenship? Will Muslim identity become deracialized insofar as an individual's phenotypical traits now will determine how they are socially raced, white, brown, Asian, or black? Or will Muslim identity be a racial marker that will permanently bar immigrant Muslims alongside African American Muslims who collectively experience second-class citizenship on account of their blackness, regardless of their religion, from the full and dignitary material harms of citizenship? So these questions animate the final chapter of the book. As I examine the responses of racial Muslims, especially the younger generation who came of age after 9/11, ranging from neoliberal multicultural interfaith initiatives to progressive cross-racial anti-race systemic racism confronting coalitions. Although calls for a new Abrahamic American national identity, which by the way is just one step, just to backtrack a bit, one of the ways in which Jews, and one of the reasons, there are multiple reasons that were domestic and international, but one of the domestic reasons why Jews and Catholics eventually were able to be socially included that whiteness was expanded, socially expanded to include them, was because they spent decades working together, Protestants, Jews, and Catholics, especially religious leaders, in redefining national identity from being a Protestant national identity to a Judeo-Christian national identity. That was not a coincidence. That was due to decades of advocacy. And once that was successful, and much of it was due to the post-Holocaust, post-World War II actions or consequences, that's when being Jewish or being Catholic was no longer necessarily an outsider status to being white. So there is a movement now of, well, why don't we call for an Abrahamic identity? And that way we can be insiders, and that should be the American national identity, which effectively means to be Abrahamic means you could then be white. Anticipating this peril, however, or although calls for a new Abrahamic American national identity may decrease discrimination against some immigrant Muslims and their children, a new exclusionary racial boundary will harm followers of non-monotheistic faiths. And anticipating this peril, a growing number of young American Muslims have joined cross-racial solidarity movements seeking to eliminate altogether America's racial religious hierarchy and the privileging of whiteness. Now, although I take into account how the racialization of African American Muslims has shaped the racialization of immigrant Muslims, this book is mainly about immigrant Muslims and their children who came post-1965. Because I agree with Professor Sylvia Chan-Malik and Professor Zain Abdullah that the racialization of African American Muslims is intertwined with the enslavement of Africans, of whom approximately, again, 30% were Muslim. I also concur with Professor Edward Curtis IV in his assessment that African American Muslims are racialized as black first, resulting in their black identity intersecting with their Muslim identity to create experiences of private and state discrimination that's uniquely different, though sometimes overlapping, with those of immigrant and children of immigrant Muslims. The root cause of discrimination against African American Muslims lies largely in the legacies of slavery, that produced Jim Crow laws, lynching, mass incarceration, school-to-jail pipelines, and extreme poverty in Black inner-city neighborhoods. In contrast, discrimination against immigrant Muslims, as I stated, is animated largely by Orientalism, American empire and Muslim-majority countries, xenophobia, and theologically based Islamophobia that originates all the way back to Europe. So, whatever the future of the racial Muslim may hold, I hope that this book demonstrates that being Muslim currently circumscribes access to the privileges of first-class citizenship, including the panoply of religious freedom rights. And for the past 2 decades, Muslims have faced the brunt of that reality. Their experience evinces what African Americans and Native Americans and Asian Americans already know. Religious freedom is not, nor has it ever been, equally available to all faiths in the United States. And irrespective of the future of American race politics and Muslims' place in it, this book is my humble attempt to equip scholars, advocates, and students like you with a deeper understanding of why a religious minority faces such blatant discrimination in a nation that prides itself on and legally privileges religious freedom. Because it is only when we acknowledge the disconnect between our ideals and our practices can we fulfill our aspirations for a more pluralistic and inclusive American society. Thank you.
It is now time for the question and answer session. Please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your questions. We reserve the first question for students, and then we will open up to the rest of the audience. And a reminder that there will be a book sale and signing after the event. We will now take the first question.